Okay, so now we get to the opportunistic period, which was actually a really great time for minority citizens in this country and for people who came from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So if you think about what was going on between the 1960s and 1980, you know that there was the civil rights movement, which fought for equal rights for African Americans and other minorities. There was also the women's movement, again, trying to set up equality between men and women. There were also rallies against war. There was the 1970s sort of hippies movement, right? In particular, Vietnam was very unpopular as a war. Basically, the whole nation was against Vietnam and sadly did not support the fact that troops were sent there and that the United States was participating in a war like that. Lyndon B. Johnson, as he's most well known for, was a president during this time, and he set up a program called War on Poverty, which provided funding for a lot of programs aimed to help minority and poor populations. So this was really beneficial too, to try and support those who had less in this country and try and provide equal opportunities for them. Okay, so we know that during this period there's sort of a general movement towards equality of opportunity and educational opportunity. And so during this opportunistic period, we see a reemergence of bilingual education. And obviously this was very much influenced by the fact that there was a civil rights movement going on, and this sense of an effort going towards establishing equality. So the first act that we're going to talk about is the Civil Rights Act, which was ratified in 1964. It was supported on the basis of the 14th Amendment, which outlawed discrimination of racial and ethnic minorities on the basis of race, color, or national origin. So again, this is where the 14th Amendment comes into play as a really important foundation for allowing for something like the Civil Rights Act to come out. There was also a 1970s memorandum that was added to this act that delineated the school district's responsibility to provide equal educational opportunity to U.S. citizens from minority groups who were considered to be deficient in English language skills or who needed more support with their English language skills. The memo also mandated that districts who served more than 5% of English language learners in the district needed to provide these students with a special language instructional program, right? So they couldn't just do nothing about it. They had to provide a particular program aimed to help these 5% or more of English language learners. And so again, this act and the fact that there was a memorandum that was added to it really symbolized the movement away from the negative attitudes and the restrictive policies that we saw from the restrictive period, and a move towards more acceptance and tolerance of ethnic languages at the federal level. Okay. So following the Civil Rights Act, we see the Elementary and Secondary Education Act coming into play. This was coming from President Lyndon B. Johnson's established War on Poverty, and sort of hand in hand with that, he designed the ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, to include funds, policies, and procedures that directly targeted low-income families and minority populations, okay, many of whom were English language learners. So this act subsequently passed or instituted a new focus at the federal level on the poor and the disadvantaged populations in the United States. Okay, so again, sort of for the first time in the United States history, and much more so than what we saw in the restrictive period, there's a light being shone on the needs of the poor and the minority populations. Okay, and that was very different to what had happened beforehand. Even in the permissive period, even though we saw some bilingual education, we saw sort of some leverage or there was some allowance for bilingual education, there was no protection at the federal level for this to happen. This is the first time we see it in this country. okay, in the form of legislation. Okay, another marker towards the support of bilingual education was in 1963, which was the beginning of a full bilingual education program situated in Miami. And this is Carl Way Elementary. And this was the first modern dual language school in the United States. This school has actually been marked as an example and a successful bilingual school. And it received political and economic support, which was, again, something that, again, the first time that happened in the modern times in the United States. And so this provided a lot of attention on dual language programs, on the sort of possibilities of bilingual education. Soon afterwards, the Bilingual Education Act was introduced as an amendment to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. And this act didn't necessarily mandate any type of instructional program for ELLs, but what it did do was it authorized federal funding in support of bilingual programs for language minority populations. So beforehand, there was never any funding provided at the federal level for those who wanted to institute bilingual education. But at this point, with that Bilingual Education Act, there were funds sort of put to the side that people could apply for bilingual education. So this undermined the English-only legislation in many states that I had discussed that was set in 1923. And it aided the movement away from this use of the sink or swim approach at the district and the school level, right? This sort of idea to have teachers do what they did anyways, even though there were English language learners in the classroom. This act, this Bilingual Education Act, was reauthorized 6 times and sort of slightly modified along the way. But it continued to appropriate funds for a variety of educational programs, including bilingual education for minority language speakers. And the last time that it was reauthorized was 2001, when Bush took over and sort of rewrote the Education Act into the NCLB. But we're going to get into that in a little bit. So the next act that I want to talk about is the Lau versus Nichols Act, which appeared as a landmark lawsuit that further defined the language rights of students in the U.S. It was decided that non-English speaking students were not receiving equal opportunities for education, as specified in Brown versus Board of Education. If you remember, that law said that equal opportunity had to be given to to minority populations. And the reason why sort of Lau versus Nichols came out was because these students were being instructed in a language that they did not understand. So this breakthrough case outlawed the sink or swim approach for ELL students because it was saying that equal education was not necessarily equitable education. If you think about it, the teacher may be using English, right, and doing the same thing for everyone. And if the teacher is doing the same thing for everyone, doesn't necessarily mean that English language learners are going to be put in a place where they can excel, or that the information that the teacher is talking about in English is going to be comprehensible to them. And so Lau versus Nichols really differentiated this equal to equitable, right? In order for something to be equitable, the instruction had to meet the diverse needs of the students in the classroom. Okay, and so this law enforced states and districts to provide one or more Lau remedies to the ELL populations, which included classes in English as a second language. It also included English tutoring, or perhaps some form of bilingual education if it was possible. Okay, so the outcome of this case raised the nation's consciousness of the need for bilingual education. And also it gave impetus towards a movement for educational opportunity for ELLs. And it also encouraged states to implement this this supportive legislation. the last thing that it did was that it placed the responsibility of providing equitable schooling on the schools, on the districts, right? Rather than on the ELLs, or in sort of putting them in a position where they had to find the resources, they had to make the information comprehensible to themselves. Rather, this Lau versus Nicol law came into place and stated that it was the school's responsibility to do that, to make sure that the education was equitable. Okay, so along with the Lau versus Nichols and the Lau remedies that came out of that gave options to the schools to make their instruction equitable, the Equal Educational Opportunities Act came out in 1974, and this reinforces the mandate upon the states and the districts to provide the appropriate services to students in schools. So it basically stated that any educational agencies, such as the districts, could be held legally accountable if they found these districts failing to provide students with programs that aided in their acquisition of English and which certified that students were receiving equitable education. So districts were now held liable to show evidence that they were providing equitable education to language minority and other minority students. Okay, the final and most recent period in the U.S. history pertaining to bilingual education is the dismissive period, beginning in 1980. So if we think about what's happening in the period of 1980s to the present, we know that there was 9/11, which had a very big effect on the way that society viewed immigrants, and in particular Middle Eastern immigrants. There was also the Reagan Revolution, which was sort of a key time period where President Reagan placed a lot of importance on English monolingualism instead of on sort of multiculturalism in an attempt to revive patriotism on this identity of being American, okay? And so he's really placing importance on cultural assimilation as opposed to bilingual education and sort of cheering on diversity and the number of different languages that our population speaks. So this shift in government really reintroduced anti-bilingual rhetoric, and it pushed in legislation that we had sort of last seen in the restrictive period. Okay, so the Castaneda versus Pickard court case of 1981 was actually a follow-up suit to the Lau versus Nichols and the Equal Educational Opportunity Act, which I talked to you before in the restrictive period. And this is when a Texas school district failed to provide Mexican-American children with an adequate bilingual education program. So the results of this case was something called the Castaneda Standards, which was a three-pronged test to certify that the programs that districts were putting into place for ELLs were actually effective and appropriate. So the first thing that it mandated was that ELL programs had to be based on sound educational theory. It also had to include appropriate instructional practices, appropriate resources, and the personnel had to be trained to know how to work with English language learners and help them succeed. And then lastly, it also built in a periodic evaluation period where the program would be reviewed for effectiveness and would be redesigned if found to be ineffective. So this three-pronged test is actually still used today to make sure that the programs that are in place in our districts are working well for ELLs and are providing that equitable education that had been mandated in Brown versus Board of Education. Okay, so with the resurgence of this sort of negative attitudes towards immigrants in this dismissive period, this next case, Plyler versus Doe, really was characteristic of this dismissive period. So the Supreme Court ruled against a Texas statute that had been put into place in the state of Texas to exclude undocumented students from receiving public education, or to force them to pay for that education, which would be provided free to everyone else. And so the Supreme Court, as I said, ruled against it, using the 14th Amendment, which again would state that undocumented students have the same right to free public education as do U.S. citizens. And it also requires that students are to remain in schools up until sort of a determined period of time. So, for example, in Florida, students have to stay in school from between the ages of 6 and 16. Okay, but you can see that the mere attempt to for a state to legislate a law like this really was indicative of the contemptuous mindset at the time. So everything that I have talked about beforehand was happening at the federal level. All of those acts and cases and laws were at the federal level. Right now I'm going to talk to you about an initiative that was being passed at the state level. And this is called English for the Children Initiative. And it was voted into several states, in California, Arizona, Massachusetts, and you can see the timeline there of when they were voted in. And this initiative was written and funded by a millionaire software programmer called Ron Unz, who was located in the Palo Alto, California area. That's the area where sort of all of the online companies, Google, for example, are located. And he had no connection to education beforehand. He sort of just jumped on this issue. And what he did is that he used misleading statistics and actually wrong information, data that was research that was done very poorly, to spread this idea that bilingual education actually hindered immigrant students' ability to learn English. Now, based on our second language acquisition sessions that we just came from, you would know that that's actually the opposite of what's true. We know that supporting a student's first language is going to have very highly beneficial influences on that student's ability to learn English. But instead, he was able to get the media involved and really spread this idea that bilingual education sort of stopped immigrant students from learning English. And so he was able to get a consensus going, and thus in these three states that I've listed below, the state voters voted this initiative into play. So this law required that all instruction in public schools be given in English only. He also instituted a sheltered English immersion program for 6 months, right, 180 days, for English language learners. So they would be put into that immersion program, and then after 6 months, they would be taken out and put into that English-only classroom. Now, we know that it takes much, much longer than 6 months for a student to learn English, and especially the English, the type of English academically needed to do well in an English-only program. You can tell that it's been at least 15 years or more that this initiative has passed, and there's a lot of research that is available at this point showing that this initiative has been very harmful for ELL students and does not hold up at all to these ideas that Ron Unz placed into the heads of voters in these states. Also, what he did was that he imposed he sort of provided a way in which parents and guardians could sue the district and the schools for not providing that English instruction to their students. So he took bilingual education and he outlawed it in those states, and he also sort of made it dangerous for districts and schools to even think about providing English language learners with access to instruction in their home languages along with English.